Crystal Baldazan, reporting live from Santa Cruz, California. Bees play a key role in pollinating our crops, 80% worldwide. Without bees, our livelihood is at risk. 75% of our crops would suffer a decrease in production, as well as 90% of all wild plants. The decline of bees in the U.S. started in 1940s. DDT was invented in 1939. Coincidence? I think not. Although the decline of bees can be attributed to factors such as disease, weather, drought, destruction of habitats, pollution, and global warming, pesticides are a leading and growing concern. According to Greenpeace USA, a single bee can pollinate over 300 million flowers a day. The major chemical companies Syngenta, BASF, Dow, DuPont, Monsanto, and Bayer have produced scientific data that creates a gap between the decline of bees and the emergence of pesticides. These are not just found in our fields, but also in our very own homes.
In the last 4 years, the chemical industry has spent $11.2 million on a PR initiative to say it's not their fault, so we know whose fault it is, by John Cooksey, director of How to Boil a Frog, documentary of overpopulation and the rapid and brutal extraction of Earth's resources.
Like Professor Rubai says, you don't generally have to convince people that broccoli is safe. Unless it comes from Monsanto, then maybe. This is a discussion to neonicotinoids, which are insecticides with a chemical component similar to nicotine. These types of insecticides act on an insect's nervous system. Neonicotinoids are also systemic, which allows them to travel in the soil and veins of plants. After doing some research at local grocery and hardware stores, I found out that neonicotinoids are easily and readily accessible. I will show 2 examples of insecticides that I found.
The major chemical companies that I mentioned before actually own 100% of the world market for genetically modified pesticides, plants, and seeds. Here are the examples of some of the things I found at the grocery and hardware stores. This is a fact sheet on paradichlorobenzene and how likely it is to contribute to the development of cancer. This is the EPA's new technology, DRT, aiming to prevent loss of pesticides during sprays, and main focus is to kill more pests and prevent liability. I chose this image on the EPA website of pesticides registration because it's contradictory. They have registered neonicotinoids that are harmful and are known carcinogens, so why bother with the guidelines? This is one of the ingredients on a chemical I found at the hardware store. I wonder who is paying the CDC. Production of knowledge is created, and yet they regulate otherwise.
On May 7, 2015, Nature, the International Weekly Journal of Science, published an article titled "Bees Prefer Foods Containing Neonicotinoid Pesticides," stating that bees prefer foods that are laced with neonicotinoids over foods that are not. Although they are highly toxic, bees cannot taste them, they aren't repelled by them, and eat less because of them, a side effect commonly seen among cigarette smokers. Makes you wonder if in fact bees are addicted to neonicotinoids. We will revisit this topic shortly.
Here is an example of molecular structures of neonicotinoids and nicotine, almost identical. Kimberly Stoner of the Department of Entomology, the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station, wrote "Honeybees and Bumblebees, Their Problems and What You Can Do to Help." These are the illustrations that show the systemic and non-systemic forms of pesticides. This graph, published in an academic journal, shows over 6 million colonies in the mid-40s, following a steady and steep decline after World War II and the emergence of pesticides.
The fringe article, "Neonicotinoids Laced Nectar Proves to be Additive for Bees," is based on academic work and focuses on foraging in bees and how that has become affected by pesticide-laced crops. The study is not just focused on foraging, but also as an issue of economics. Many crops would be economically affected if bees were to no longer exist. A study conducted at the Newcastle University drew a conclusion that although bees cannot taste the difference, they can tell the difference, and that's because they are addicted. Bumblebees, when compared to honeybees, consume higher levels, and that is because bumblebees have smaller colonies and smaller hives, so it would take less amount of time to spread around the hive. They observed neurobiological mechanisms similar to the ones observed in cigarette smokers. Bees found it more rewarding to consume pesticide-laced crops since they are addicted. Another fringe article by Carl Matheson supports the same study on addicted bees. Now we will be talking about a local agency who is responsible for managing and overseeing this phenomena of toxicity through neonicotinoids and its exposure through pesticidal drift and bees. Aroma, California is home to one of Driscoll's farms and was founded in 1966. Has an annual revenue of $800,000. Driscoll's began expanding to Central California in the 60s, escaping workers organizing in Oxnard, California. I began reading fringe articles about numerous lawsuits against Driscoll's for pesticidal drift. This is defined as the movement of pesticides through the air, affecting not only the intended target, but also anything up or downwind of the area. I contacted Driscoll Farms in the Aromas areas, and the first woman I spoke to was Barbara. It was an interesting experience. I began talking to her about the Driscoll's website. I told her that I liked the way they emphasized not only using pesticides as a way of eliminating pests, but also using more natural ways, such as other bugs, oils, and other stuff that I will discuss. So Barbara told me that after I pushed a little bit about what pesticides they use, she told me that the EPA gives Driscoll's 100 approved pesticides in which they can use. They then pass that on to individual farms of Driscoll's where the farmer chooses specifically on his problem on the farm. So they had no record or anything of what each individual farm chose, or the Aromas California one, which is the one I was inquiring about. So she said that they do not use a lot of pesticides because they're expensive, and she said that they test the soil, the water, and the berries before buying them back from the farmers. And she told me, and I quote, by the time we buy back the fruit, there is like a drop of water in a swimming pool of pesticides, end quote. She said that they may use them one year and they may not use them the other year, depending on plagues or the type of pest, the type of year that they come around. I also told her that I wanted to know more information about the specific pesticides that were used in Aromas, California. She told me that I had to be very careful, and in the way I presented myself, I told her that I was a student and that I was doing a report. She told me that I should mention that when talking to the people in charge of the Aromas California, because they might be a little weary that I'm a news reporter, which is when I got a little skeptical and asked her, well, what if I was a news reporter? Isn't this public information? All she said was, and I quote, "There's a lot of controversy with our pesticides," end quote. So I began digging a little bit further. She told me that they often use ladybugs, bats, and this thing called Driscoll's bug vac, which is literally a vacuum that sucks up insects in the farm. And so she told me to call the Aromas California. I called the Aromas California Driscoll's, which was actually very difficult to find the number to. I actually found it. I was pretending to apply for a position, which is when I got the phone number, and I was able to kind of contact them. I talked to this person named Juan, which I guess was in sales or in the front desk. I asked him about the pesticides, and he said that the food safety department was the best department to speak to regarding the pesticides. He also told me that the best time to reach them was at 7:30 a.m. So I woke up at 6:30, I prepared my questions, and I called. I was sent back and forth until I was transferred to a voicemail. and I got no answers from anyone. No one seemed to know. And so I decided to go up there, try my luck. I drove half an hour only to be told that the person with that information was not available. So my initial observation is, where are the bees? We're part of this regime of imperceptibility that doesn't allow us to see what we have already naturalized, such as pesticides. It's similar to what Finocchi was saying in his article about pure war and military suburbanism. We have created in this peacetime economy, ways in which we attack our world even though we're not directly in war. With my Driscoll's approach, I kind of reached a dead end, but I did notice this production of knowledge, and where I was kind of guided. No one gave me any answers, which was fine because it actually directed me into looking into the addiction of bees and how it's very similar to the nicotine effect on humans. After studying the EPA and the CDC, they had very contradicting wording and language, which I think is really important. I've also started noticing the placement of the word safe in both of those official agencies. But there is hope. There are things we can do, like buying local honey and supporting beekeepers, creating safe havens, spots where bees can come and multiply and build their hives. Also, planting flowers that attract bees without any pesticides. We don't want any more addicted bees. So, yeah, there's always some hope.